There comes a moment in life when two energies meet, not by accident, but by divine orchestration. One has spent years running from connection, building silent walls, mastering the art of distance. The other has walked through the fire of their own emotions, faced abandonment, healed their wounds, and emerged whole. When an avoidant meets a healed empath, something extraordinary begins to unfold. The empath no longer begs to be chosen. They no longer shrink themselves to fit into someone else's fear. They stand grounded, rooted in self-worth, guided by inner peace. Their love is no longer desperate. It is deliberate. It is no longer loud. It is powerful in its stillness. And that stillness, it unsettles the avoidant. Because for the first time, they are not being chased. They are not being pulled, persuaded, or pursued. Instead, they are being seen. And being truly seen is something an avoidant has spent a lifetime trying to escape. The healed empathist becomes a mirror, not of perfection, but of truth. In that reflection, the avoidant begins to notice something unfamiliar. Their patterns no longer work. Silence no longer controls the dynamic. Distance no longer creates power. Instead, it reveals emptiness. It exposes the illusion they once lived in, that independence without vulnerability is strength. But real strength is the courage to stay. The empath teaches without forcing. They show through their presence what it means to love without losing oneself. They demonstrate boundaries without anger, compassion without anger, compassion without sacrifice, and connection without control. And here lies the divine principle. Love is not meant to be chased. It is meant to be met. The avoidant stands at a crossroads. One path leads deeper into old habits, comfort, isolation, emotional safety that slowly becomes a prison. The other path leads toward growth, toward vulnerability, discomfort, and ultimately freedom. Because when faced with healed love, you can no longer pretend you don't need it. You can only decide whether you are brave enough to receive it. The empath will not wait forever. Not because they don't care, but because they finally care about themselves. More, they understand that love must flow both ways. That connection requires presence, and that their peace is not negotiable. This is where transformation becomes possible, not through pressure, not through force, but through awareness. When the avoidant chooses to step forward, even slightly, they begin to experience something they have long avoided, emotional truth, and in that truth, they discover that vulnerability is not weakness. It is the doorway to the very connection they have always desired, but feared. And if they choose not to step forward, the empath still wins, because a healed soul never loses by loving. Because a healed soul never loses by loving dog in. They only refine, realign, and rise. So understand this deeply. When an avoidant meets a healed empath, it is not just a relationship. It is a test of evolution. One is invited to rise, the other is already there. And in that sacred meeting, the universe whispers a timeless truth. You cannot receive the depth of love you desire until you release the depth of love you desire, until you release the fear that keeps you shallow.
The question is no longer what happens between them.
The question is, who will choose to grow? A healed empath reaches a place where their emotional world is no longer governed by urgency, fear, or the need for external validation. Fear or the need for external validation. There was a time when they felt everything deeply and responded immediately, when love meant giving endlessly, proving their worth and holding on tightly even when it hurt. But healing reshapes that instinct. It transforms emotional intensity into emotional intensity, into emotional intelligence. Instead of chasing, they begin to observe. This observation is not cold or detached. It is conscious. They pay attention to actions rather than words, to consistency rather than promises, to energy rather than appearances. They understand that people reveal themselves not in moments of charm, but in patterns of behavior. And so they slow down. They listen more. They feel without reacting impulsively. Where they once would have filled silence with effort, they now allow space to speak for itself. Where they once would have overextended to maintain connection, they now step back to see if that connection can stand on its own. This shift is powerful because it is rooted in self-respect. A healed empath no longer confuses intensity with intimacy. They recognize that true alignment does not require force. It does not demand that one person carry the emotional weight for two. Instead, it flows naturally with mutual presence and shared effort. Because of this awareness, they stop attaching themselves to potential and begin valuing reality. They no longer fall in love with what someone could be. They honor what someone consistently is. Choosing alignment over attachment becomes their guiding principle. Attachment is often driven by fear, the fear of losing, of being alone, of not finding something better. Alignment, on the other hand, is rooted in truth. It asks a simple but profound question. Does this connection meet me where I am, in a way that feels peaceful, reciprocal, and real? If the answer is no, the healed empath does not try to force it into a yes. This doesn't mean they stop loving deeply. In fact, they love more purely than ever before, but their love is no longer entangled with self-abandonment. They no longer ignore red flags or silence their intuition just to keep someone close. Their empathy is balanced with boundaries. They understand that not everyone who enters their life is meant to stay, and they make peace with that. This peace allows them to walk away when necessary, not in anger, not in resentment, but in clarity. They release what does not align without needing closure from the other person because they have already given it to themselves. They trust their inner voice more than external reassurance. And in this state, something remarkable happens. Their presence changes. They become calm where they once were anxious, grounded where they once felt scattered, selective where they once were open to everyone. People can feel this difference, even if they cannot explain it. There is a quiet strength in someone who no longer seeks approval, who no longer tries to convince others to stay, and who no longer tries to convince others to stay, and who no longer negotiates their worth. This is the essence of a healed empath. They no longer chase love, because they have become aligned with it. An avoidant individual has often learned, consciously or unconsciously, that emotional closeness comes with risk. At some point, vulnerability may have felt unsafe, whether through rejection, inconsistency, or emotional overwhelm. So they adapt. They create distance, prioritize independence, and maintain control by keeping their inner world guarded. Over time, this becomes their normal. Distance feels safe. Detachment feels like strength. But when they encounter genuine grounded love, especially from someone who is healed, it disrupts that familiar pattern. A healed presence does not behave the way they expect. There is no pressure, no chasing, no emotional chaos to justify withdrawal. Instead, there is calm, consistency, and quiet confidence. This kind of energy does not invade their space, yet it does not disappear either. It remains steady, and that steadiness becomes confronting, because for the first time, the avoidant is not reacting to someone else's instability. They are facing their own. Genuine love, when it is rounded, acts like a mirror. It reflects not only what is being offered, but also what is being withheld. In the presence of someone who communicates clearly, respects boundaries, and remains emotionally available without losing themselves, the avoidant begins to notice the contrast. They see the gap between connection and their own discomfort with it. This is where the internal conflict begins. Part of them is drawn in. They feel the safety, the absence of games, the sincerity. It is unfamiliar, yet deeply appealing. But another part of them resists. That part associates closeness with loss of control, with expectations they may not feel ready to meet, or with emotions they have long avoided processing. So they may pull back, not because the connection is lacking, but because it is real. Real connection requires presence. It requires openness, consistency, and a willingness to be seen. For someone who has built their identity around self-protection, this can feel overwhelming. The walls they once relied on no longer feel entirely justified, yet letting them down feels equally uncomfortable. And so, they stand in tension between desire and defense. The healed individual does not chase them through this tension. They do not try to fix, rescue, or convince. Instead, they remain grounded in their own truth. This is what makes the situation even more confronting. The avoidant can no longer rely on the familiar dynamic where distance creates pursuit. There is no emotional overcompensation waiting on the other side of their withdrawal. There is only stillness, and in that stillness, they are left alone with their own patterns. They begin to notice how often they deflect, how quickly they shut down, how instinctively they create space even when it isn't necessary. They may start to question whether their independence is truly freedom or simply avoidance in a more acceptable F. This realization is not immediate, nor is it always comfortable. It can bring up frustration, confusion, and even guilt, because deep down, they may recognize that what stands in the way of connection is not the other person, it is their own fear of it. Yet within this confrontation lies an opportunity to acknowledge that the walls they built to protect themselves may now be limiting them, to understand that control is not the same as safety, and to consider, perhaps for the first time, that closeness does not have to mean losing oneself. It can mean discovering a new way of being that includes both connection and autonomy. When the dynamic between an avoidant and a healed empath begins to unfold, the familiar cycle of pursuit and withdrawal starts to lose its grip. In the past, this pattern may have felt almost automatic, one person reaching out, seeking closeness, trying to bridge emotional distance, while the other retreats, creating space, preserving control. It is a rhythm built on imbalance, where one invests and the other resists, but healing disrupts this rhythm in a profound way. The healed empath no longer participates in the chase. They do not interpret distance as a signal to try harder. They do not respond to silence with anxiety-driven effort. Instead, they pause, they observe. They allow the space to exist without rushing to fill it. This single shift changes everything because the dynamic can no longer sustain itself in the same way. Without pursuit, withdrawal loses its power. For the avoidant, this creates an unfamiliar experience. The usual expectation that distance will trigger attention, reassurance, or emotional pursuit is no longer met. Instead, they are faced with neutrality. The empath remains steady, neither clinging nor collapsing. This steadiness becomes disorienting because it removes the external validation that once supported the avoidance patterns. What emerges in its place is a mirror. The dynamic is no longer about one person chasing and the other escaping. It becomes a reflection of two internal states, growth versus resistance. The healed empathist embodies growth. Their actions are intentional, their boundaries clear, their presence grounded. They are not trying to prove their worth or secure connection through effort. They are simply showing up as they are and allowing the connection to either meet them there or fall away. The avoidant, on the other hand, is confronted with a choice. They can continue to operate from resistance, maintaining distance, avoiding vulnerability, and holding on to familiar coping mechanisms. Or they can begin to move toward growth, questioning their patterns, softening their defenses, and allowing themselves to engage more fully. This is where the dynamic becomes deeply revealing, because in the absence of the chase, there is nothing left to hide behind. The focus shifts inward. The avoidant can no longer attribute the tension solely to the other person's behavior because that behavior has changed. There is no pressure, no emotional overwhelm being projected onto them. There is only a calm, consistent presence that quietly asks, "Will you meet me here?" And meeting someone in that space requires courage. It requires letting go of the illusion that distance equals safety. It requires acknowledging that avoidance, while protective in the past, may now be limiting connection in the present. Most importantly, it requires a willingness to be seen, not partially, not selectively, but authenticating distance, minimizing emotional expression, maintaining control through detachment, once served a purpose. These patterns protected them. They offered a sense of stability in situations where vulnerability may have led to discomfort or pain. But healing, whether it begins within themselves or is reflected through a connection with someone grounded, starts to challenge the effectiveness of those patterns. What once worked no longer feels the same. Distance, which once provided relief, begins to feel like disconnection. Silence, once a form of control, starts to feel like emptiness. Avoidance, which once created safety, slowly reveals itself as a barrier to the very connection they may desire. This shift is subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but over time it becomes impossible to ignore. Because awareness changes everything. When someone begins to see their own patterns clearly, they can no longer engage in them unconsciously. The autopilot turns off. Each moment of withdrawal, each instinct to shut down, each hesitation to open up becomes a conscious choice rather than an automatic reaction. And with that awareness comes a certain level of discomfort. There is a quiet realization that what once felt like strength may actually be limitation. This realization does not always bring immediate change. In fact, it often creates internal conflict. Part of them wants to continue operating in familiar ways. It's easier, it's predictable, it requires less emotional risk. But another part begins to question whether easy is actually fulfilling, because emptiness has a way of echoing. When patterns are exposed, their long-term impact becomes visible. The missed connections, the conversations left unfinished, the relationships that never fully developed, the emotional depth that was never explored. What once seemed like control begins to feel like loss, and this is where the shift begins to deepen. Healing does not force transformation, but it makes stagnation harder to tolerate. It brings a level of consciousness that disrupts complacency. The avoidant may start to notice that the same patterns keep leading to the same outcomes. Temporary comfort followed by lasting dissatisfaction. The cycle becomes clear. They pull away, they regain a sense of control, but eventually they feel the absence of something meaningful. They may try to dismiss it, rationalize it, or distract themselves from it, but the awareness lingers. It quietly reminds them that something is missing, not externally, but internally. This is the turning point, because once a pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. The question is no longer whether the pattern exists, but whether it will continue to be chosen. And choosing it now carries a different weight, because it is no longer unconscious. It is intentional. At the same time, the presence of someone healed amplifies this awareness, not through pressure but through contrast. When they witness a different way of relating, one that is open, balanced, and grounded, they begin to understand that connection does not have to come at the cost of self. That vulnerability does not automatically lead to pain. That emotional presence can coexist with personal independence. This understanding plants a seed, and even if it does not immediately lead to change, it begins to reshape perception. What once felt sufficient starts to feel incomplete. What once felt safe starts to feel restrictive. And slowly, the idea of doing things differently, of stepping beyond avoidance, begins to feel not only necessary but possible. At the core of any meaningful connection lies a simple yet demanding truth. Awareness must replace fear, and growth must take precedence over comfort. Without this shift, even the most powerful encounters remain incomplete. When an avoidant and a healed empath cross paths, the potential for transformation is undeniable. But potential alone is not enough. It requires a conscious choice from both sides. Awareness is the first doorway. It asks each person to look inward with honesty. For the avoidant, it means recognizing the patterns of withdrawal, the instinct to create distance, the habit of protecting themselves at the cost of connection. It requires acknowledging that these behaviors are not random, but rooted in fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control, fear of being seen too deeply. For the healed empath, awareness takes a different form. It is the recognition of past tendencies to overgive, to fix, to hold on beyond what is healthy. Even in their healing, they must remain conscious not to slip back into old patterns of self-sacrifice. Their growth depends on maintaining boundaries, honoring their needs, and resisting the urge to carry the emotional responsibility of another. Awareness, in this sense, is not a one-time realization. It is an ongoing practice of observing thoughts, reactions, and choices in real time. But awareness alone does not create change. There must also be a willingness to move beyond fear. Fear often disguises itself as logic or self-protection. It says, stay guarded, it's safer is way, or don't get too close, you might get hurt. And while these messages may have once been valid, they can become barriers when left unchallenged. Growth requires questioning those internal narratives and choosing differently, even when it feels uncomfortable. For the avoidant, this might mean staying present in moments where they would normally retreat. It might mean expressing thoughts and emotions instead of suppressing them. It might mean allowing someone to get closer than feels familiar without immediately pulling away. For the healed empath, moving beyond fear might mean stepping back instead of leaning in. It might mean allowing space without trying to control the outcome. It might mean walking away when alignment is not met, even if feelings are still present. Both are being asked to grow, but in opposite directions. One must learn to open, the other must learn to release. And this is where comfort becomes the true challenge. Comfort is seductive. It keeps people in familiar cycles, even when those cycles are unfulfilling. For the avoidant, comfort lies in independence without vulnerability. For the empath, it may lie in giving without limits. Both forms of comfort prevent evolution. Choosing growth disrupts that comfort. It introduces uncertainty, emotional exposure, and the possibility of change. It requires letting go of what feels known in exchange for what is more aligned. And this is not an easy decision. It demands courage, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping it. When both individuals choose this path, when awareness guides their actions and growth becomes their priority, the dynamic transforms. It is no longer driven by fear-based reactions, but by intentional choices. Communication becomes clearer. Boundaries become respected. Connection becomes something that is built, not forced. But if one or both remain attached to comfort, the transformation cannot fully occur, because growth is not something that can be carried by one person alone. It must be chosen individually, and then met collectively. Thank you for your time and presence. May your journey be guided by clarity, growth, and inner peace. Goodbye for now, and may you continue rising into the highest version of yourself